I can see the way social media is being shaped by the national security state to set the stage for still censoring us on the grounds of being disinformation, even though we're presenting factual journalism. Because the term disinformation has been so relentlessly abused in the last 3 or 4 years that it's being used basically to define anything that is not, that doesn't exist within the foreign policy, US foreign policy consensus. I mean, we literally get called in these articles a disinformation site or a conspiracy site. That's another word that's been abused. The FBI 2 years ago said that conspiracy theories are a national security threat. And so when somebody calls us a conspiracy site without proving that we're engaging in false conspiracies, like Russiagate, for example, they are using cop language. And I think what they're trying to do, as Ben said earlier, is to get us censored. And censorship by these elements, which often have real relationships, real concrete relationships with the US government, with the State Department and intelligence cutouts, that's so much more dangerous than cancel culture.
I'll never apologize for the United States of America. Ever. I don't care what the facts are.
Why are we going to sit down and talk to these quote-unquote moderate rebels?
Who are the truly moderate rebels?
The search for the moderate rebel. Do these moderate rebels exist?
Moderate
Rebels.
This is Moderate Rebels. I'm Ben Norton, joined by my co-host Max Blumenthal, and this is part 2 of our discussion with our colleague at the Gray Zone, Aaron Mate. And in the first part, we picked apart Russiagate, something that we've been talking about a lot on this show and at the Gray Zone. Aaron Mate is one of the leading debunkers, the leading experts showing why Russiagate is based on, a bunch of lies and conspiracies. In the first part, we also talked about the Democratic National Convention and the neoliberal Democratic Party and how Joe Biden, does not really have anything good to offer anyone, which is why more than half of the people who say they're voting for him are only voting for him, why he's Donald Trump. So definitely check out part 1. In the second part, we're going to talk about censorship. And the Gray Zone has been facing a lot of attacks recently over our fact-based reporting, and there have been numerous corporate media articles attacking us that, of course, don't challenge any of the facts in our reporting. It all relies on baseless insinuation, Cold War kind of fear-mongering, and they're trying to link us to Chinese state media. It's ridiculous. This is a neo-McCarthyite campaign. So in this episode, we're going to talk about the new Cold War and how the U.S. government is pressuring social media corporations to censor alternative media. This is something that we've been documenting at the Gray Zone, censorship of alternative sites in the U.S., of Venezuelan, Syrian, Russian, Iranian accounts. And it's something that is getting worse and worse by the day. So here I'm going to cut to part 2.
This whole McCarthyite narrative is used to indict anyone who diverges from the new Cold War consensus, all the way up to the occupant of the White House and what he did in his 2016 campaign. And Ben, you just wrote a piece, which I think is relevant, about a fairly new outlet on the scene, which turns out to be this Operation Mockingbird style outfit that was clearly dispatched to attack us for doing the same thing on China, for puncturing the State Department's hostile and sensationalist narrative about China, because as intense as the Cold War is against Russia, it has been accelerated and amplified against China in the past few months in ways that we have not seen in our lifetimes.
Yeah, that's absolutely right. And for anyone who's interested, you can go to the Gray Zone. And the piece is called U.S. Government-Funded Dakota Story Smears American Journalists Who Undermine New Cold War Propaganda. In this piece, I just showed how this neoconservative website that's relatively new, was launched a few years ago, Dakota Story, is largely bankrolled by Western governments, by these foundations that are backed by billionaire oligarchs who also provide kind of plausible deniability for Western governments, right? Because they work together. So there are these right-wing conspiracies about George Soros, and there are anti-Semitic attacks on him. That doesn't mean that he's a good guy. This is a neoliberal billionaire who's devoted his entire life to overthrowing socialist governments everywhere they are. And he's really closely linked to the U.S. national security state and to European governments. And a lot of his money through the Open Society Foundations funds all of these regime change organizations, and also the National Endowment for Democracy, which is a CIA cutout. It's the U.S. government's regime change arm, and it funds Dakota Story, this media outlet that attacked us. So this is effectively a U.S. government-funded outlet attacking American journalists who expose the crimes of the U.S. government. And we always hear about authoritarian governments attacking journalists. I mean, this is a great example right here where we're under attack by a U.S. government-funded institution. Dakota Story is also funded by the European Endowment for Democracy, which is much newer. The NED was founded in the 80s by the Ronald Reagan administration as a CIA cutout to do the work that the CIA had done during the first Cold War. When it was wrapping up, they just started doing it in the open. And Alan Weinstein, who is one of the co-founders of the NED, he said openly in an interview with David Ignatius, who's the kind of CIA's best friend at the Washington Post, he said, Alan Weinstein said openly, we're doing now what the CIA used to do 25 years ago. So then the European government...
He said, we're doing what the CIA did in the past covertly, we are doing now overtly. That's what the NED is.
Exactly. And the European Union launched its own version of it. It's called the European Endowment for Democracy, which is funded by 23 European governments who are members of the EU, and the UK now. And what's incredible is that this cutout essentially attacked us and didn't dispute a single fact in our factual reporting. We were reporting, just showing how these new Cold War smears against China, they all come from either Western governments or from Uyghur separatist groups that are funded by the US government, that are these right-wing groups that explicitly make their demand clear that they want to slice off Xinjiang province, an autonomous region, and create what they call East Turkestan. And you even now see this separatist language has been totally adopted, not only by many US politicians, but also corporate media outlets. They will frequently use this term, East Turkestan. There's no such thing as East Turkestan. This is separatist language used by these right-wing separatist groups. So, I mean, it's absolutely incredible. So we produced factual journalism documenting all of this, and Dakota Story didn't dispute a single fact we reported.
What we did was, and the credit especially goes to Ajit Singh, who is a freelance contributor to the Gray Zone, is a Canadian lawyer and scholar, getting his PhD, and he just went into one of the most sensationalistic narratives, which is the claim that currently, as we're speaking, millions of Uyghurs in Xinjiang, which has about 13 million people in it, millions of them, anywhere between 1 and 3 million, are inside concentration camps, being tortured and killed in a genocide. And he looked for the source on these numbers and found two sources. One was Adrian Zentz, who is the most dubious character possible, someone who I do not believe speaks Chinese. I don't know where his expertise on China or Xinjiang or the Uyghurs comes from.
Well, Max, his expertise on China was bestowed upon him by the Victims of Communism Memorial Foundation.
Where he is a fellow. So he's a fellow at like a ridiculous partisan operation in Washington called Victims of Communism. It's like when you hear that there's a memorial called Victims of Communism, if you're not like some young Republican who dresses like Alex P. Keaton, you're just gonna laugh. But he's a fellow there. He's taken so seriously in Washington. He's from Germany, and he's written a book. His first book was about the rapture and tribulation, the coming tribulation. He's an end-timer evangelical who rants in the book against diversity education. He calls it the work of the devil. He attacks homosexuality, abortion, all the usual hobgoblins of the Christian right. He's very interested in applying scriptural spanking to children to discipline them so they don't grow up to be like us, I guess. And this German, and he says that, most Jews will die in the rapture and go to hell. They'll burn in an everlasting lake of fire, as the book of Revelations predicts, but 144,000 will be refined in God's fiery furnace. And remember, this book was originally written, I think, in German. This guy's German. So when a German's talking about putting Jews in a fiery furnace, and he says that he wants them to be put in a fiery furnace, whether he's German or not, it's kind of anti-Semitic. You've definitely, like, in my view, you just got like a few screws loose. And then he comes to Washington and emerges as the top Xinjiang scholar.
Well, Max, you forgot one very important point, that his evangelical extremist ideology is very noteworthy, of course, but what makes it even more relevant, because, people attacking us will say, well, yeah, sure, he's got some bizarre views, but why is that relevant? It's relevant because why is he interested in China? Because he's convinced that God sent him on a mission to destroy the Communist Party of China, to overthrow the Chinese government. He has said that in writing. He literally, it's like the Blues Brothers, where we're on a mission from God. I mean, he literally thinks he's on a mission from God, but unlike them, who are on a mission from God to fight Nazis, he's on a mission from God to overthrow the Chinese government.
Well, the Blues Brothers were on a mission to, like, be white guys who sing Sam and Dave and, like,
but who are their
Hooker
enemies? The Blues Brothers' enemies are the Chicago Nazis. They fight the Nazis.
Right. They beat up the Nazis and they, threw them in the river, and it was like, I'm pro Blues Brothers. The Adrian Zentz could not be further from the Blues Brothers. He's like, I don't know what he is. I don't know what he's the Wagner brothers. I mean, he's like, when I hear him like speak, I hear like Tannhauser, a people's chorus in the background. But, besides all that, I mean, and why does he hate the Chinese Communist Party? Because it's atheist. I mean, the Christian right hates China. They're a big part of the Cold War narrative right now, and they're heavily invested in. Ben, you wrote about how Nuri Turkel, from one of these Uyghur separatist lobbying groups in Washington that's funded by the U.S. government, is on the U.S. Religious Liberties Commission, which is basically currently run by the Christian right, by this Christian right fanatic Tony Perkins, who I've written about in the past. So there's definitely like a nexus there. But the funny thing is that when Zentz gets quoted and cited, it's by the New York Times, it's by liberals. And you look at his reports, and it wasn't that we just pointed out that he's an extremist Christer. I mean, what Ajit did was go into his reports and show how shoddy his methodology was, and that he was basing these numbers, these sensationalistic numbers intended to paint China as the new Nazi Germany, on interviews with less than 10 people, which were published in sectarian Uyghur publications like Istiklal, which themselves cannot be considered credible. And then we have the second source. There are two sources on all of this. The second source is Chinese Human Rights Defenders, which is based in Washington, funded by the U.S. government, based out of, I think, the same office as Human Rights Watch. And they interviewed 8 Uyghurs from Xinjiang, then extrapolated from the population of their villages the entire number of 1 million to 3 million. And as a result of those articles that we published, I mean, when I go into the gray zone to edit it, I can take a look at our traffic. Those articles, particularly the one about Adrian Zentz and the Chinese Human Rights Defenders, I think they might be our top trafficking article ever. Like, every day they get like 1,000 views or more, because people are constantly being bombarded with this propaganda, and they want to find something critical that takes a look at the methodology and goes behind it. And that's what I think is happening, and that's why we became such a threat to this narrative. The Chinese Human Rights Defenders issued a report and defending its numbers. It wouldn't have had to have done that if we hadn't done this. And that report, Ben, as you demonstrated, it's like a feedback loop where they link back in everything to either their own data or Adrian Zentz and nothing else, basically proving our point.
Yeah, Chinese Human Rights Defenders, and by the way, I should stress that this is an organization funded by the U.S. government, run by right-wing anti-China dissidents who supported the Iraq War and all of these, and going back further, I mean, it's a relatively new organization, but some of the people involved supported the Vietnam War. They were Cold Warriors. And then now they have this new group, and they want to lobby the U.S. government to effectively overthrow the Chinese government. And it's called Chinese Human Rights Defenders. And this group, they claimed in this document they posted on their website defending their report, where they extrapolated 8 people to the entire population of Xinjiang. They say, well, of course our report is correct. It's been corroborated by Human Rights Watch and Amnesty International. And then I went to the reports they link to, the reports they themselves, Chinese Human Rights Watch, Chinese Human Rights Defenders link to at Human Rights Watch and Amnesty International's websites. And those websites, in turn, link back to either Chinese Human Rights Defenders or to Adrian Zentz. So it just shows that there are only 2 sources that these people are citing over and over again. And we should ask a lot of questions about them. We should also say, look, Adrian Zentz doesn't speak Chinese. He says that he has access to these Chinese government documents. Where did they come from? And who translated them? Can we trust the translations? Can we trust the provenance of these supposed reports? And we already know that the methodology of the Chinese Human Rights Defenders reports is extremely bogus. And then the only other sources that are ever cited are unsubstantiated reports from Radio Free Asia, which is a propaganda arm of the U.S. government created literally by the CIA during the Cold War after the victory of the Chinese Revolution. So that's what all of these sources are. But if you acknowledge that fact, the dearth of evidence, none of us is saying, long live Xi Jinping and the Chinese Communist Party. No, we're just saying, look, these reports are really flimsy. And if you say that, oh, well, you're a Holocaust denier, and we're now under very brutal attack. And clearly, in my view,
it's not a brutal attack. I mean, it's just it's a coordinated attack.
It's a coordinated attack from numerous media outlets.
I'm not being brutalized.
And I think what their strategy is, it's pretty clear to me. They want to get us censored. They want to get us kicked off of social media outlets, which is why they're in an insanely dubious way trying to link us to the Chinese government, because a Chinese diplomat tweeted a link to our article, and then we didn't even mention. So after the Dakota story report, so-called report, it's just a hit piece. After this hatchet job, it was part of a 1-2 punch attack. The next article came out a week later in Axios, and this is an even more ridiculous article that doesn't cite any facts, and it is devoted entirely to smearing us by quoting the Republican co-chair of the ranking member of the House Foreign Affairs Committee. And in this article, what's incredible is they cite this U.S. intelligence cutout that's called the Alliance for Securing Democracy, which is based in a D.C. think tank called the German Marshall Fund, which it's spun out of the Marshall Plan, and it's funded by the U.S. government and NATO and the German government. It's this Cold War relic. And so they have this neocon institution based at the German Marshall Fund, which is called the Alliance for Securing Democracy. And they run this thing called the Hamilton 2.0 dashboard, which is run by these former State Department and former intelligence agency spooks. And what they do is they monitor Twitter and Facebook for accounts that are linked to either foreign governments, mostly the Chinese government and the Russian government, and different state-backed institutions. And so they're trying to say that somehow that we're linked to the Chinese government because some Chinese diplomats have tweeted our articles. And what's incredible is that after the Axios so-called reporter edited this article to include that incredibly dubious claim, she actually was unable to substantiate it. And Aaron called her out on Twitter and said, wait, I went to the Hamilton 2.0 dashboard and I actually can't find what you're accusing us of. Where's your methodology? And her response was, go to it and you'll find it. And she refused to show what the supposed data is. I mean, it's clearly a totally factless, unsubstantiated, fabricated campaign, smear campaign to try to link us to China so they can censor us.
But even if it were true, I just want to even if it were true, that's, as you pointed out, Ben, and I think this is important to stress, even if it were true that somebody who works for a Chinese media outlet or who even works in the Chinese government, if they liked a gray zone tweet or if they retweeted a gray zone tweet as if that proves something, And the fact that we're going to rely on a US government-funded neocon propaganda outfit to prove that point, it's farcical on its face. But then it's even more farcical when exactly challenged to show her data, she refused to do it, and couldn't come up with anything because the dashboard itself doesn't even really, as far from when I tried to port through it, it didn't really show anything. It showed that there are some people who work for Chinese television or media, and maybe a couple of diplomats who've retweeted or liked some Gray Zone articles, as if that even means something.
Just to kind of step back and put it in context. I mean, this is the first time we've had an elected member of Congress, and not just any member of Congress, but basically the Republican who speaks for Mike Pompeo's State Department at the House Foreign Affairs Committee, Michael McCall, denounce us to say anything about the Gray Zone. So it's obvious we are making a huge impact and we're disturbing them. We are threatening their narrative that they're rolling out to amplify, to accelerate the Cold War. So I really, was when I saw him say that, I felt pretty good about what we'd done.
And it's amazing that in the past, that would, on the left, be deemed to be widely seen as a badge of honor. People would be celebrating the fact that a lefty media outlet is being attacked by the Republican chair of the House Foreign Affairs Committee. But you even have some people not only, ignoring this whole issue, some people are even trumpeting that Axios article as somehow damning for the Gray Zone. I think it's damning for and embarrassing for anybody who wants to basically join hands with Mike Pompeo and the Republican chair of the House Foreign Affairs Committee in attacking us. And it speaks to like the room for this kind of reporting on the left has really shrunk. I don't recall a time when basically this kind of skeptical adversarial reporting is so minimized and it's so maligned even amongst other leftists. It's one thing to ignore an issue, but even the fact where you see it being maligned, I don't ever recall a time like this. And to illustrate, the first time I ever heard of Adrian Zentz was when Democracy Now! Had him on about a year ago. And I'm just looking back now, they don't even mention that he was a senior fellow at the Victims for Communism Foundation. They call him an independent researcher and expert on China's minority policies.
Which is just two lies.
Yeah.
It's true that, Democracy Now! Would host people like Ed Herman, maybe Michael Parenti, not as much, even Noam Chomsky, who would challenge the humanitarian interventionist narratives, which are based on human rights claims spun out by the U.S. intelligence agencies and the human rights groups which exist as sort of external arms of those agencies. If you are like truly an anti-imperialist, an anti-war leftist, or an anti-war person, you understand how human rights is weaponized by the US government and by the West to implicate their targets of regime change and to stimulate support for military interventions and sanctions and hostile activity among parts of the population that normally don't go along with hard US power. Specifically, the same element, constituency or demographic that was targeted by the Russiagate narrative. Coastal, middle class, generally educated, liberal types. They go for the human rights stuff. And the Xinjiang narrative has also helped bring Muslim Americans back into the State Department fold after the post 9/11 period when they were targeted by the US government. And they're, being targeted by this as well as supporters of the new Cold War on China. And it's clearly working. If you look at Democracy Now!, obviously they're picking up on the humanitarian interventionist narratives on Xinjiang as well as Hong Kong. Jacobin, they're pushing it. The Intercept has pushed it to some extent. The Nation is really pushing it. I saw an article, Dave Zirin published a piece. This is their sort of lefty sports reporter. He published a call for solidarity with Hong Kong and the Uyghurs to boycott the Olympics in Beijing, and just basically rattled off a bunch of literal State Department talking points. It was the definition and encapsulation of State Department socialism. So in many ways, we're kind of in the wilderness with this, even though it is factual journalism. And I knew when we were going to publish these pieces that it needed to be done because this is what being anti-war is all about. It's all about puncturing the hostile narratives that are fake or that are sensationalistic. None of us denied that there could be repression in Xinjiang or mass surveillance, but we're talking about a separate narrative that's hyperbolic and designed to spin out war with China. And so when we do it, we're not being treated the same way that in a different era Ed Herman was or Michael Parenti were when they challenged the State Department lies about the war in Yugoslavia. But at the same time, we have to remember that they came under extremely harsh ballistic attack from places like the New Republic, from the kind of social democrats and the liberal interventionists like Michael Ignatieff. They were attacked as well. So this is part of a long tradition and a long running battle. And, all I can say is that I knew we were going to be attacked this way. I've been prepared for it psychologically and emotionally for years by constantly being called an anti-Semite by non-Jews for my work on Palestine. It means nothing to me, and we just have to keep punching holes in these hostile narratives. So yeah, the Axios piece was confirmation of the impact we're making. If you're watching this right now and you're supporting moderate rebels or you're supporting the Gray Zone, you help make that happen. You are helping to make us feel inspired to continue doing this work. So, don't forget how much your support matters, because unlike Coda Story, which is funded by the US government and a bunch of billionaire regime change cutouts, and unlike Axios, which is just this corporate publication, we're truly independent.
And unlike other adversarial websites, no one here is making a six-figure salary and not producing very much journalism. So the support for the Gray Zone is really, really appreciated, and it goes a long way.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, and I'm ready to get back to the Democratic National hermetically sealed Zoom call. It's not, but before anything else you want to add?
Yeah, before we move away from this and start wrapping up, I just wanted to show people. I got up the tweets from. This is the Axios reporter, Bethany Allen Ibrahimian. And I should also mention that, like Adrian Zentz, like Mike Pompeo, this is an extreme Christian fundamentalist. And
no, wait a minute. No, I communicated with her, and when she was 8 years old, her family sacrificed a sheep in their neighbor's yard for Jesus, and she tweeted about it. But she said that she no longer holds those views. But she comes from that context. What's notable about her? Anyone listening and you think, we're just getting into like our own inside baseball stuff. Like just think about Operation Mockingbird, when it was a scandal and the Senate Church Committee investigated journalists for basically fronting for the CIA. This is someone who published these very dubious China cables at the International Consortium of Investigative Journalism, which is funded by many of the same billionaire regime change cutouts that fund Coda Story, like Pierre Omidyar. And she quoted Adrian Zentz as her expert. And these leaks were supposed to also provide some sort of heft, journalistic heft, to the claims Zentz was making about concentration camps and so on in Xinjiang. So the Yahoo News reported that the CIA, they interviewed a bunch of CIA officers who were kind of complaining that the CIA has become basically a US version of WikiLeaks, and all they're doing is hack and dump operations where they're hacking China, Russia, Iranian servers, and then they're dumping compromising information on journalists, which sounded exactly like what happened here with China cables. So I think this is the essential background on Bethany Allen Ibrahimian, and I would like to know more from her about how she obtained these cables. But in any case, you've got the tweets up.
Yeah, so this is her sharing the Axios article. Chinese state media loves the Gray Zone, but they're not the only ones. Yeah, it's actually true. We have a huge, dedicated, awesome fan base that we love, and we're growing a lot, and that's why you all feel so terrified, because they feel threatened by us. And so after she shared this ridiculous tweet to this article that cites no facts, and it's all defamation, it's all opinion disguised as supposedly neutral reporting, and then she responded, which is her acknowledging how bogus implicitly acknowledging how bogus her article is. She said, "R.I.P. my mentions probably," and then after she followed up. And by the way, she did this the day after, so clearly it seems very likely that someone from the Alliance for Securing Democracy, which is a U.S. intelligence and State Department cutout run by a bunch of spooks and neocons, it's likely that someone contacted her who also have been trying to attack the gray zone, and they fed her this very questionable claim. And she said, Chinese diplomatic Twitter accounts show a high degree of engagement with the gray zone articles, according to data compiled by the Alliance for Securing Democracy's Hamilton 2.0 dashboard. And what's incredible is, if you look at the replies, and by the way, I'm looking at the replies here from the gray zone Twitter account because Bethany Allen Ibrahimian blocked me for calling out these extremely dubious claims that you could honestly just say are total factless smears. So here's Aaron asking her. Aaron said, "Hi, Bethany. On what basis do you conclude that supposedly Chinese diplomatic Twitter accounts show a high degree of engagement with gray zone articles?" And then she said, referring to the Hamilton 2.0 dashboard, "It's an online interactive tool, not a report. If you need help figuring out how to use it, the team who runs it can help." So this is like an arrogant, condescending response saying, well, just do it yourself. And then Aaron said, "I don't need to ask for anyone's help. I'm asking you to substantiate your own claim. Please show us this data." And then she replied, "Use the tool yourself." And that was her last. And then she said, "The data is available to you from the original source. You know how to obtain it. If you want to see it, I recommend that you reach out to the people who made the Hamilton dashboard." And she also followed up, "I encourage you to reach out to the people at the Alliance for Securing Democracy if you are unable to use the tool effectively on your own." So what she's saying here is that
there was a tool that was used. A reporter for Axios was used
exactly
to launder a Cold War deception and to smear an actual journalistic website. That was the tool that was used.
She's unable to point to the data because the data is not there. And she doesn't know, because clearly it's very obvious that she was fed this.
Well, I don't even care if the data's there. It proves
exactly.
nothing. It's not like
Yeah.
I mean, I was retweeted by the president of the United States. So does that mean that I'm a U.S. government asset now? Or I mean, people were trying to say, oh, you're a Trump asset because I said something mean about John Bolton. So Trump retweeted me. I mean, I had, some older people that I just, people I know personally, like, who are not like political friends, they were like, "Why did you tell Trump to retweet you?" Because they don't know how Twitter works. So, I mean, it's just a ridiculous, it's like the Hamilton 2.0. It's like sort of like a McCarthyite guilt by association machine that can use.
Well, on
for
that
whatever
note, this is a good
purpose they want.
segue. It's really important to point this out. I was going to mention that this isn't the first time that the spooks, and when I say that, I mean, Hamilton 2.0 is run by the Alliance for Securing Democracy, which is created by former U.S. spies and State Department operatives. This is an intelligence agency cutout. And we actually wrote an article about them our colleague Alex Rubinstein last year. No, actually, it wasn't even last year. It was February 2020. And here you can find this at the Gray Zone. I have it up. It's called State-Backed Alliance for Securing Democracy Disinfo Shop Falsely Smears the Gray Zone as State-Backed. And we show how this, I mentioned this is an organization funded by the U.S. government and the German government and NATO, and they falsely claimed that we, and also another independent journalism website run by Jordan Sheraton, both alternative, independent, left-wing media sites, they accused us of being state-backed, which is, first of all, a total projection, but totally false. It's an absolute lie. And then...
Was that retracted?
No, it never was retracted. And then
they issued some follow-up tweets saying, kind of not correcting, but saying, well, we've noticed that other state entities retweet the Gray Zone, and that's why we said it.
Yeah, and what's incredible,
it's just sort of a slick way,
is after that pushback that we did, the Hamilton 2.0 dashboard added to its own website, which is so funny because Bethany Allen Ibrahimian linked to that link. She linked to the website, and then you click on the link, and if you actually read it, which no one ever does, because they just take these ridiculous smears at face value without any critical thinking. But if you go to it, and I have up the relevant section here, it says clearly in red font on the Hamilton 2.0 website, quote, it would be incorrect in all caps, it would be incorrect to, without further analysis, label anyone or anything that appears on the dashboard as being connected to state-backed propaganda. So that's them, I mean, for legal reasons, obviously, if we wanted to sue them, that's them for legal reasons saying, well, actually, there's no proof that these are state-backed entities. What they're actually doing is just totally a smear operation, but the reason they exist is for lazy journalists like her who are fed these supposed factoids that are totally bogus. They can just put it in the article and say, according to this official sounding Alliance for Securing Democracy, a DC think tank, according to them, they're linked to state media, which is totally ridiculous.
And you know what? I think this actually helps explain some of the resentment towards us from some of these people. It's actually not just that we are contradicting their political narrative. They also resent that we use facts. Yeah. I really believe that. Because they don't use facts. They rely on drinking the Kool-Aid and promoting the fashionable narrative, which doesn't require any facts. And in fact, it requires
and not
ignoring
just that,
facts.
They're fed press releases.
And they're fed so like they're acting as spokespeople.
They don't do reporting.
They don't report, so they resent people who are not. And that's why, I mean, just to tie in another issue to this, when I published that recent article in The Nation magazine, just summarizing the OPCW scandal and the fraud that was used at the OPCW to silence the whistleblowers who were challenging the cover-up of their investigation in Syria that actually showed that a chemical attack was likely staged and that their evidence was suppressed under U.S. government pressure. When I published a very watered-down, I should say, article in The Nation, or a very diplomatic article in The Nation magazine, laying out all the facts of the case, the reaction was apoplectic, but nobody, of course, could challenge a single fact.
Yeah, and who are what is the element that attacks you the most forcefully in the most coordinated fashion? It's an element that exists within the same U.S. regime ecosystem as Coda Story. It's Bellingcat.
Yeah.
And Bellingcat, you know, it's always marketed as like this investigative journalism site, but in many ways, it's really like a troll farm for attacking people who contravene the dominant hegemonic narratives of U.S. foreign policy. So they come at you and they insult you and everything. But was there any engagement with, you know, the points you made on their merits?
I mean, to my knowledge, nobody submitted a correction because I haven't gotten any queries about that from The Nation magazine. So no, but because how can they? And that's the whole point. And that's why it's the same thing with all the coverage of you guys in terms of your China coverage. There's no engagement with the facts that you're reporting and the claims you're making, the points you're making. It's all innuendo and it's relying on government propaganda sites to smear you.
It's so revealing. I mean, it's I don't know how to describe ourselves as like a beta test or something, but I mean, we learned so much about the media from its reaction to our own work. And we can see they have this sense of inviolability where they expect that anyone who challenges their narratives can easily be written off as RT or CGTN. And when they can't write us off as that, they look for other ways to implicate us as some kind of foreign intelligence operation or something. And so far, it hasn't worked because there's no there. There's no proof of it because it's not true. At the same time, I can see the way social media is being shaped by the national security state to set the stage for still censoring us on the grounds of being disinformation, even though we're presenting factual journalism. Because the term disinformation has been so relentlessly abused in the last 3 or 4 years that it's being used basically to define anything that is not, that doesn't exist within the foreign policy, U.S. foreign policy consensus. I mean, we literally get called in these articles a disinformation site or a conspiracy site. That's another word that's been abused. The FBI 2 years ago said that conspiracy theories are a national security threat. And so when somebody calls us a conspiracy site without proving that we're engaging in false conspiracies, like Russiagate, for example, they are using cop language. And I think what they're trying to do, as Ben said earlier, is to get us censored. And censorship by these elements which often have real relationships, real concrete relationships with the US government, with the State Department and intelligence cutouts, that's so much more dangerous than cancel culture. So that's what I think we're facing right now. And, if you've been supporting us, again, I mean, we've arrived at a point where just as a very small site, we have managed to threaten the narrative of the new Cold War to the point where we're being denounced by high-level members of Congress. And I really think that, that's a tribute to what we've been able to do since we went fully independent and broke out from Alternet in 2018. And we're just going to keep doing more of that.
Yeah, and I'll say the threat of censorship is very real. And today is August 19th, and we saw, a lot of us woke up this morning and saw an example of this. Friends of ours are already being censored. Venezuela Analysis, which is an indispensable website. It's a totally independent website, by the way. It's run mostly by Americans, by people from the US who are not even Venezuelan. They don't have links to the Venezuelan government. But on Twitter, their account has been restricted for no reason. And it's part of a series of other accounts who have been censored, suspended. I've documented at the Gray Zone, written several articles showing how Twitter and Facebook, which owns Instagram, and Google, which owns YouTube, have censored hundreds, thousands of accounts that are foreign, even if from Iran, Venezuela, Syria, Russia, China. Even if these accounts are not actually government accounts, that's already a form of censorship that we should oppose. But even individuals who are journalists and activists who don't work for their governments are being censored. And it was only a matter of time before this comes back home. And Gareth Porter, a brilliant reporter and who freelances with us, published an article at the Gray Zone showing how the FBI personally intervened to try to censor alternative media websites. So this is just the beginning, I think, unfortunately, and the censorship is growing. And we're talking about what we can do to try to back up our content on other platforms and diversify. But, the reality is that people say, well, join Mastodon, join whatever other website. And okay, that's fine. But the issue is that there are billions of people who use Facebook. There are hundreds of millions of people who use Twitter. There are billions of people who use YouTube. And we don't want to just preach to the choir. We want to continue to grow and engage with people and change their minds and influence, the way they think about the world and educate them. And if you just are preaching to the choir on a small independent media outlet, a social media outlet, I think that doesn't, that doesn't have nearly the same reach. So this is a real issue that we're grappling with. And I think we all need to realize that, not just us, but anyone, our viewers and our colleagues, anyone who's invested in trying to push back against corporate media propaganda and frankly, state propaganda. This is state propaganda. We're living in a very dangerous authoritarian time. And as much as the U.S. prides itself on supposedly being the beacon of free speech, we were seeing that free speech curtailed more and more every day.
Well, I think that's a good place to wrap. Right, Aaron, you don't want to talk for another hour?
I'm good. I'm good.
Yeah, so that's a good place to wrap. And we're going to be back soon with another Moderate Rebels. We've been a little bit slower on the uptake than usual, but we're going to be back. So thanks for supporting us. If you're not already supporting us, just go to patreon.com/moderaterebels. And we're out.